We are taught that a painting is merely canvas and oil, a static imitation of life. But in the winter of 1892, a locked studio in London revealed a terrifying exception. When authorities forced the door, they found the artist dead, his body contorted in agony. The portrait he had been working on was finished, but the paint was wet, the expression had changed, and it was staring at the corpse with a look of impossible, sentient malice. The studio at number 14 Cheyne Walk was less a place of art than a fortress of solitude. Arthur Blackwood, at 42, was widely regarded as London's most technically proficient portraitist. Though critics often noted a certain coldness in his work, he captured likenesses, not souls. His subjects were rendered with surgical precision, every pore, every stray hair, but the eyes always remained flat, devoid of that spark which separates a masterpiece from a diagram. This limitation never bothered Arthur. He was a man of science who happened to use oil paint. He believed in what he could see, measure, and replicate. He did not believe in the intangible. This skepticism would be his undoing. It was late November when the letter arrived. Heavy cream stationery, no crest, signed in a sharp, angular hand. Elias Thorne. The request was standard, a full-length portrait, but the terms were unusual. The sittings must take place at night, and Arthur was to work in absolute seclusion. No assistants, no visitors. The payment offered was triple Arthur's usual fee. A rational man might have hesitated at the eccentric conditions, sensing the trap in the details. Arthur, driven by a mixture of professional arrogance and simple avarice, accepted immediately. He viewed the restrictions not as a warning, but as a challenge to his efficiency. Elias Thorne arrived on a Tuesday evening, stepping out of the dense fog that had swallowed the Thames. He was a striking man, perhaps 30 years of age, dressed in impeccable evening wear that seemed slightly out of date, cut in the fashion of a decade prior. But it was his stillness that Arthur noticed first. When Thorne sat in the velvet armchair on the dais, he did not fidget. He did not shift his weight to find comfort. He simply ceased to move. His breathing was so shallow it was imperceptible, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed too slow to sustain human life. For the first hour, the only sound in the studio was the scratch of charcoal against canvas. Arthur worked methodically, sketching the rough geometry of the man's face. High cheekbones, a sharp, aristocratic nose, and eyes that were dark, almost black. As Arthur sketched, a peculiar sensation began to prickle at the back of his neck. Usually, the artist is the observer, the subject the observed. The dynamic of power lies with the one holding the brush. But in that cold, high-ceilinged room, the dynamic felt inverted. Thorne's gaze never wavered. He wasn't just posing, he was watching. And in that unblinking stare, Arthur felt analyzed, dissected, as if his own internal composition was being laid bare. By the end of the first session, Arthur was exhausted in a way he had never experienced. His muscles ached as if he had been lifting heavy stones rather than holding a stick of charcoal. His hands trembled as he placed his tools on the side table. Thorne stood up fluidly, his joints making no sound, and smoothed his coat. "You have a steady hand, Mr. Blackwood," Thorne said. His voice was soft, cultured, but it carried a strange resonance, like a cello bowed in an empty hall. It seemed to vibrate in the air long after the lips had stopped moving. "I look forward to seeing what you find in me." He left as quietly as he had arrived, disappearing into the London night. Arthur locked the door behind him, turning the key twice. He told himself it was just the draft from the river, or the fumes of the turpentine, that made him shiver. But as he looked back at the rough charcoal sketch on the easel, he couldn't shake the feeling that the room was still occupied. The outline of Thorne's face seemed to absorb the light from the gas lamps, sitting in the center of the room like a void. Arthur threw a cloth over the easel, extinguished the lights, and went upstairs to bed, unaware that he had just invited a predator into his home. The sittings settled into a rhythm that was less a routine and more a ritual of erosion. For 7 consecutive nights, Elias Thorne arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, took his place in the velvet chair, and ceased to be a living man, becoming instead a statue of flesh and bone. He did not speak unless spoken to, and Arthur, who usually filled the silence of his studio with the scratching of brushes and his own muttering about light and shadow, found his voice dying in his throat. The silence in the room was heavy, possessing a physical viscosity that seemed to clog the air and dampen the gaslights. Arthur prided himself on his speed. He was a man who painted with the efficiency of a surgeon, laying down layers of glaze and pigment with calculated foresight. Yet with the Thorne portrait, he found himself faltering. It was not a lack of technical skill. The underpainting was flawless, the anatomy precise. The issue lay in the translation of presence. Every time Arthur looked up from his palette to the dais, Thorne seemed subtly different. The angle of the jaw appeared sharper, the shadows under the eyes deeper, the expression shifting from neutral observation to a faint, imperceptible mockery. Arthur would mix a specific shade of ochre for the skin tone, look up, and realize the light had changed or the skin had. He would scrape the canvas down and start again, his frustration mounting like a fever. "You are struggling," Thorne said on the 4th night. It wasn't a question. He hadn't moved a muscle, yet his voice carried clearly across the 12 feet of floorboards separating them. "The light is inconsistent," Arthur snapped, his patience fraying. He was wiping a palette knife with a rag that was already stiff with dried paint. "And you? You have a difficult face to map, Mr. Thorne. The planes are elusive. Perhaps you are trying to paint what you expect to see, rather than what is there," Thorne replied. His eyes, dark and unblinking, bored into Arthur. "Do not paint the anatomy, Arthur. Paint the intent." That night, after Thorne left, Arthur broke his own rule. He usually covered his works immediately to let them rest, believing that fresh eyes in the morning revealed errors hidden by fatigue. But this time, he poured himself a glass of brandy and sat directly in front of the easel, staring at the wet canvas. The face that stared back was undeniably Elias Thorne, yet it was wrong. Arthur had painted the eyes with his usual technical perfection. The reflection of the studio window in the iris, the moisture of the tear duct, but on the canvas they looked predatory. He leaned in closer, the fumes of turpentine stinging his nose. He had painted the mouth in a straight, impassive line. He was certain of it. He remembered the specific stroke of the hog hair brush, pulling the alizarin crimson and white across the linen. But now, under the flickering gaslight, the corner of the painted mouth seemed to curl upward by a fraction of a millimeter. It wasn't a smile. It was a sneer. Arthur rubbed his eyes, attributing the distortion to exhaustion and the brandy. He reached out to touch the canvas, intending to smudge the corner of the mouth back into neutrality, but his hand stopped inches from the surface. A wave of irrational repulsion washed over him, a primal instinct warning him not to touch the wet paint, as if the oil and pigment were biological matter, infectious and raw. He retreated to the back of the studio, leaving the canvas uncovered. That night, sleep was a jagged, fractured thing. He dreamt he was back in the studio, painting, but instead of oil paint, his palette was filled with gray fluid that moved on its own. And in the dream, every time he applied a brushstroke to the canvas, he felt a sharp, cutting pain across his own face, as if the portrait were painting him in return. By the 12th night, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted from professional tension to a stifling, sickly intimacy. The concept of time had begun to dissolve for Arthur Blackwood. Day and night held no meaning. There was only the sitting and the waiting for the sitting. The heavy velvet curtains remained drawn at all hours, blocking out the gray London winter and sealing the room in a perpetual gaslit twilight. Arthur had stopped shaving. He ate only when his stomach pains became distracting, consuming stale bread and cold tea while standing before the easel, muttering to himself about glazes and undertones. The portrait was nearing completion, yet it remained impossibly, frustratingly wet. Oil paint requires time to oxidize, to harden into a permanent film, but the pigments on this canvas remained as slick and glistening as the moment they left the tube. It was unnatural. Arthur had tried adding drying agents cobalt-cicative, litharge, but the chemistry failed. The paint refused to cure. It stayed open, receptive, like a wound that refused to scab. And as the portrait remained wet, the subject seemed to drain the room of vitality. Elias Thorne looked healthier with each passing session. The pallor that had defined him on the first night was replaced by a subtle, luminous flush. His eyes, once dark voids, now held a glint of predatory amusement. He sat with more presence, occupying the chair not just as a physical body, but as a gravitational force. Arthur, conversely, was withering. He caught a glimpse of himself in the dusty mirror, propped against the far wall, and barely recognized the reflection. His skin had taken on the gray, pasty quality of wet clay. His eyes were sunken, rimmed with red, darting nervously in their sockets. His hands, usually steady as stone, now developed a fine tremor that only ceased when he picked up a brush. It was as if the dexterity was no longer his own, but something he'd borrowed exclusively for the act of painting Elias Thorne. "You look tired, Arthur," Thorne observed. It was 3 a.m. The silence outside was absolute, the fog dampening the city sounds. "I am fine," Arthur rasped. His voice sounded thin, brittle. "Just the fumes. The ventilation is poor." "It is more than fumes," Thorne said softly. He stood up from the chair and walked toward the easel. This was a breach of protocol. The subject never approached the work until it was finished, but Arthur found he lacked the will to stop him. Thorne stopped beside Arthur, bringing with him a scent that was not cologne, but something older like turned earth and copper. Thorne looked at his own likeness. He smiled, and simultaneously, Arthur felt a sharp, sympathetic twinge in his own jaw, a phantom mimicry of the movement. "You are capturing something?" "Vital," Thorne whispered, leaning in close to the canvas. "Do you feel it? The flow?" "The paint won't dry," Arthur confessed, the words spilling out before he could check them. "I've used every dryer in the cabinet. It stays wet. It moves." Thorne turned his head slowly to look at Arthur. The gaslight caught the moisture in his eyes, making them shine with a terrifying clarity. "Why should it dry, Arthur? Life is fluid. Only dead things are static. You are creating life, are you not?" He reached out a gloved hand and hovered it near the cheek of the portrait. "It is hungry," Thorne said. Arthur stepped back, his heel catching on a rag, nearly stumbling. "I think we should stop for tonight." "As you wish," Thorne said. He buttoned his coat, his movements elegant and full of energy. "Rest, Arthur. You will need your strength for the eyes. They are the windows, after all, and we must ensure the house is occupied." After Thorne left, Arthur locked the door and collapsed onto the small cot he kept in the corner. He fell into a feverish sleep, but he did not dream. Instead, he woke up 3 hours later, standing in front of the easel in the dark, his brush in hand, wet with paint. He had no memory of getting up. He struck a match, his hands shaking violently, to see what he had done in his sleep. The portrait had changed. The background, which Arthur had painted as a neutral dark void, now contained faint, swirling shapes, faces perhaps, or hands pressing against the fabric of the reality behind the subject, trying to push through. The gray light of morning brought no relief, only a starker illumination of the impossible. Arthur stood before the easel, a palette knife, clutched in a hand that felt foreign to him. The background of the portrait, originally a flat, negative space, was now teeming with indistinct forms. They were rendered in a style that was not Arthur's. Where his strokes were precise and academic, these were chaotic, swirling, reminiscent of smoke or drowning currents. And yet they possessed a terrifying depth. He applied the knife to the canvas, intending to scrape away the aberration. He pressed the steel blade against the wet pigment and dragged it down. The paint should have yielded, smearing into a muddy gray. Instead, it resisted. It felt not like oil and linen, but like cold, taut skin. The knife skittered over the surface, leaving no mark. Arthur pressed harder, panic rising in his chest, digging the tip of the blade into the swirl of faces. The canvas did not tear. The paint merely rippled, as if he had disturbed the surface of a dark pond, and then settled back into its original maddening configuration. He dropped the knife. The clang against the floorboards sounded deafening in the silence. Arthur realized then that he could not stay. The triple fee, the professional pride, none of it mattered. He grabbed his heavy wool coat, not bothering with a hat, and fumbled with the locks on the studio door. He would go to the Royal Academy. He would speak to his physician. He would simply walk until the air in his lungs didn't taste of turpentine and old blood. He stepped out into the fog. It was thicker than usual, a wall of white that swallowed the street lamps. Arthur walked briskly, turning left toward the river, counting his steps to anchor his mind. He walked for 20 minutes, head down, fighting the damp chill. By his calculation, he should have reached the bridge. He looked up, expecting to see the iron railings. Instead, he was standing at the foot of the steps to No. 14 Cheyne Walk. The black door loomed before him, the brass knocker gleaming dully. He had walked in a straight line. It was impossible. He turned around, heart hammering, and ran into the fog. He ran until his chest burned, turning corners, crossing streets. He ran for an hour, and when he finally stopped, gasping for air, clutching a lamppost for support, he looked up to find himself once again standing exactly where he had started. The house was not just a location. It was a gravity well. He unlocked the door and went back inside. He had nowhere else to go. When Elias Thorne arrived that evening, he didn't knock. He simply turned the handle of the locked door and entered. He found Arthur sitting on the floor before the covered easel, shivering despite the fire in the grate. "You tried to leave," Thorne said. It wasn't an accusation, merely an observation, delivered with that same terrifying calm. He removed his gloves, revealing hands that were pink and flushed with vitality. "What are you?" Arthur whispered, not looking up. "I am a patron of the arts," Thorne replied, a smile touching his lips. He stepped onto the dais and took his seat. "And you, Arthur, are the conduit. The vessel must remain until the contents are poured. You understand this, don't you?" "I can't paint any more. My hands ... Arthur held them up. They were stiff, the joints swollen. "You can," Thorne commanded softly. "The eyes, Arthur. We must finish the eyes." Arthur stood. He moved like a marionette, his strings pulled by an invisible hand. He approached the easel and removed the cloth. The painted face seemed to inhale as the air hit it. Arthur picked up his brush. He dipped it into the black pigment. As he touched the brush to the canvas to begin the iris, a jolt of cold electricity shot up his arm. He gasped, but could not pull away. He watched in horror as the color from his own hand seemed to drain, flowing down the brush handle, into the bristles, and onto the canvas. The skin of his fingers turned a translucent, dead gray, while the painted eyes suddenly glistened with a wet, human sheen. The deterioration was no longer confined to Arthur's hands. It spread up his arms like gangrene, a creeping desaturation of the flesh. By the 15th night, the sensation of touch had largely abandoned him. He held the brush not through tactile feedback, but through a grim, mechanical muscle memory. His skin had tightened against his skull, giving him a skeletal, rictus appearance, while his movements became jerky and insectal. The studio, too, had begun to sympathize with its occupant's decay. The fruit in the still life bowl on the sideboard had collapsed into a pool of black mold overnight. The velvet drapes were moth-eaten, shedding fine dust that hung in the stagnant air. Yet in the center of this rot, the portrait of Elias Thorne stood as a beacon of impossible preservation. It didn't just reflect light, it seemed to generate it. The oil paint possessed a lustrous depth that defied physics, the colors rich and oxygenated, pulsating with a biological warmth that made the surrounding room look flat and dead by comparison. Elias Thorne sat on the dais, no longer bothering to pose. He simply watched, his legs crossed, a look of profound satisfaction settling on his features. He looked younger than ever vital, flush with blood, his hair thick and glossy. The transaction was becoming undeniably literal. "The eyes are almost done," Thorne remarked. His voice was no longer a whisper. It was a resonant baritone that vibrated in Arthur's chest cavity. "Do you see the truth of them now?" Arthur didn't answer. He couldn't. His tongue felt like a piece of dry leather in his mouth. He was focused entirely on the left iris of the portrait. He was painting the reflection, a tiny curved distortion of the studio window caught in the moisture of the eye. It was a detail that required absolute precision. As Arthur applied the flake white to create the catchlight, the spark of life, he felt a sudden, violent pop behind his own eyes. It was soundless, a sensation of pressure releasing, followed by an immediate dimming of the world. The edges of his vision grayed out. The vibrant colors of the rug, the warm glow of the gas lamp, the rich mahogany of the easel, all of it drained away, leaving him in a world of muddy, monochromatic shapes. He blinked, terrified, trying to clear his vision. But the gray remained. The only thing in the room that retained color, the only thing that possessed sharpness and clarity, was the portrait. It blazed in high definition against the blur of his fading reality. "A fair exchange," Thorne said, standing up. He loomed over Arthur, who was now squinting, trying to find the man through the fog of his own failing sight. To create a true vision, the artist must give up his own. "You don't need them anymore, Arthur. I will see for you." Arthur dropped the brush. He brought his hands to his face, clawing at his eyelids. His eyes felt cold, glassy, as if they were turning into marbles. He looked at his hands and saw them only as vague, skeletal shadows. "It is finished," Thorne declared. He walked to the canvas and touched the wet paint of the face, his face. He didn't smudge it. His finger passed through the surface tension of the paint, as if dipping into water. "No, not quite. The signature. You must sign your work, Mr. Blackwood. It binds the contract." Thorne picked up the fallen brush, dipped it into a mixture of crimson lake and Arthur's own blood that had dripped from a cracked knuckle, and pressed it into Arthur's numb hand. He guided Arthur's stiff arm to the bottom right corner of the canvas. "Sign," Thorne commanded. Arthur signed. He didn't look at the name. He couldn't read it through the gray haze. But as the letters formed, he felt a final heavy gate slam shut within his mind. The connection was sealed. The room spun, and the floorboards rushed up to meet him as consciousness finally surrendered to the void. The official police report, filed by Constable James Reed of the Chelsea Division, on the morning of December 14th, 1892, is a document characterized by a struggle between bureaucratic restraint and visceral horror. The authorities had been summoned by Arthur Blackwood's landlady, Mrs. Gable, who reported a noxious effluvium seeping from beneath the studio door and a profound, unnatural silence that had persisted for 3 days. Constable Reed noted in his log that the door to the studio was locked from the inside. The key was later found still inserted in the mechanism, turned fully to the engaged position. When Reed and a locksmith forced the heavy oak door, the draft that escaped was cold enough to condense their breath, despite the fire in the grate having burned down to ash days prior. The scene that greeted them was chaotic. The studio, usually a space of disciplined order, was a wreckage of overturned furniture and scattered supplies. But the chaos was arranged in a specific radial pattern, as if an explosion of sheer panic had occurred in the center of the room, pushing everything outward toward the walls. In the center of this blast radius lay Arthur Blackwood. The artist was dead. The coroner's report would later cite cardiac arrest induced by extreme sympathetic nervous system overload, a clinical euphemism for death by fright. But the physical condition of the body defied such a simple explanation. Blackwood's body was contorted into a rigid arch, his spine hyperextended, his fingers hooked into claws that had dug deep gouges into the floorboards. His skin was a translucent gray, desiccated and tight against the bone, resembling a corpse that had been decomposing for weeks, rather than a man who had been seen alive days earlier. Most disturbing were his eyes. They were wide open, fixed on the easel, but they were entirely milky white. The corneas had clouded over with a density that suggested prolonged chemical damage or rapid cataract formation. And then there was the painting. Standing untouched amidst the ruin, resting on the easel like an altar, was the full-length portrait of Elias Thorne. While the rest of the room was covered in a layer of grime and decay, the canvas appeared pristine. The oil paint possessed a wet, rich luminosity. The figure of Thorne was rendered with a realism that made Constable Reed recoil. In his later personal journals, Reed wrote that walking in front of the canvas felt like walking past an open window on a winter night. The portrait depicted Thorne standing with an air of imperious satisfaction, looking down. The perspective was masterful. No matter where one stood in the room, Thorne's eyes seemed to track the viewer. But it was the direction of the gaze that unsettled the officers most. The painted figure wasn't looking out at the horizon. He was looking down, directly at the spot on the floor where Arthur Blackwood's twisted body lay. The signature in the bottom right corner was still wet. It was a jagged, desperate scrawl in a dark, crimson pigment that matched the dried blood found under Blackwood's fingernails. It did not read Arthur Blackwood. The letters, formed in the erratic hand of a dying man, spelled out a single word: empty. As the undertakers moved to lift Blackwood's body, the easel rattled. There was no wind in the room. No one had touched the canvas. But both Constable Reed and Mrs. Gable would testify under oath that as the corpse was disturbed, the expression on the painted face shifted, the lip curling upward just a fraction, cementing the sneer into a look of triumphant contempt. The liquidation of Arthur Blackwood's estate took place on a damp Tuesday in January 1893, handled by the reputable firm of Halloway and Sons. The tragic and rumors suggested bizarre circumstances of the artist's death had created a macabre sort of interest in the sale. The auction room was packed not just with serious collectors, but with the morbidly curious, those who wanted to own a piece of the mad painter of Cheyne Walk. Lot 42 was the final item of the day: portrait of an unknown gentleman. The catalog description was sparse. It noted the dimensions, 6 feet by 4, the medium, oil on canvas, and the artist. It did not mention the subject's name, for Elias Thorne appeared in no social registers, no census records, and no birth certificates found by the estate executors. To the world of bureaucracy, the man in the painting did not exist. When the heavy velvet curtain was pulled back to reveal the canvas, the murmur of the crowd died instantly. It wasn't the respectful silence of appreciation. It was the instinctive hush of a herd sensing a predator. The gaslights in the auction hall seemed to dip, casting long wavering shadows against the paneled walls. The auctioneer, a Mr. Percival Graves, was a man of shaken nerves. He had spent the morning organizing the lots, and he would later confess to his wife that he could not bear to turn his back on Lot 42. He felt a constant, prickling heat between his shoulder blades whenever he looked away from it. Now, standing at the podium, he struggled to keep his voice steady. A striking example of Mr. Blackwood's late period, Graves stammered, avoiding the eyes of the painted figure. Bidding starts at 50 guineas. Usually, a work of such technical mastery would spark a flurry of paddles. but the room remained motionless. The wealthy patrons of London society stared at the canvas, and the canvas stared back. The painted eyes of Elias Thorne seemed to bore into the crowd with a look of amused contempt, judging their clothes, their jewelry, their fragile mortality. A dowager duchess in the front row pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and signaled her companion to take her out, whispering that the air had suddenly turned violently stale. The silence stretched, becoming agonizing. Just as Mr. Graves was about to withdraw the lot, a single paddle rose in the back of the room. It belonged to Sir Julian Hargrave, a railroad magnate known for his immense wealth and his complete lack of superstitious imagination. Hargrave was a man of iron and steam. He believed in what he could touch, build, and sell. He saw the crowd's hesitation not as a warning, but as a lack of fortitude. 100 guineas, Hargrave announced, his voice booming through the quiet hall. There were no counterbids. The gavel fell with a sound like a cracking bone. The relief in the room was palpable. The other attendees seemed desperate for the object to be removed from their presence. Hargrave had the portrait delivered to his townhouse in Belgravia that very evening. He ordered it hung in the main entrance hall at the foot of the grand staircase, where it would be the first thing visitors saw upon entering. It was a statement piece, a declaration of dominance. However, the servants of the Hargrave household did not share their master's bravado. By the second night, the downstairs staff had begun to organize their duties in a way that avoided the main hall entirely. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, reported that the family dog, a fearless Irish wolfhound named Caesar, refused to cross the foyer. The animal would stand at the threshold of the dining room, hackles raised, growling low in its throat at the oil painting, before whining and retreating to the kitchen. Sir Julian dismissed these behaviors as hysteria. He stood before his purchase on the third night, swirling a glass of cognac, admiring the purchase. "They are afraid of you?" Hargrave muttered to the painted figure. "Good. Fear commands respect." He turned to head upstairs to bed. As he placed his foot on the first step, he heard a sound behind him. It was faint, wet, and deliberate. It sounded like a tongue parting from the roof of a mouth. Hargrave froze. He turned slowly, the gaslight casting his shadow long across the floor. The hall was empty. The portrait hung silently in its frame. But as Hargrave peered closer, squinting in the dim light, he noticed a change. The painted hands of Elias Thorne, previously resting idly at his sides, now appeared to be slightly raised, the fingers curled as if anticipating a handshake or a throat. Rationalism is a fortress, but it is built on the fragile foundation of observable rules. Sir Julian Hargrave's fortress began to crumble at 3:17 a.m. on January 16th. He had gone to bed convincing himself that the shifting hands in the portrait were a delusion, a byproduct of cheap cognac and fatigue. He was a man who built railways. He dealt in steel and timetables, not shifting pigments. He was awakened not by a noise, but by a smell. It was a thick, chemical cloying scent linseed oil, turpentine, and something metallic, like old copper coins. It permeated the heavy air of his master bedroom, overriding the scent of lavender from the linens. Hargrave sat up, his heart rate instantly doubling. The house was silent, but it was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that precedes a thunderstorm. Then came the sound. From the hallway outside his door, the grand gallery that overlooked the foyer, came a wet, heavy rhythmic noise. Slap, drag. It sounded like wet canvas being pulled across the floorboards. Hargrave grabbed the heavy brass candlestick from his bedside table. He did not waste time lighting it, and a revolver he kept in the drawer. He was a man of action, and he intended to confront the intruder. He threw open his bedroom door, stepping out onto the landing. The gas lights in the hallway were turned down low, casting long skeletal shadows against the damask wallpaper. The corridor was empty, but the floor was not. Stretching from the top of the grand staircase leading directly toward Hargrave's room, was a trail of footprints. But they were not made of mud or dirt. They were thick, viscous, and black. They glistened in the dim light, cooling slightly at the edges. Hargrave knelt to touch one, his finger coming away, coated in a substance that was cold and sticky. It was oil paint. Black, raw umber, and crimson. Hargrave wiped his hand on his nightshirt in revulsion and moved to the railing to look down into the foyer. The gas chandelier in the entrance hall had been extinguished, leaving the space in a cavernous gloom. He strained his eyes toward the spot where the portrait hung. The frame was there, a rectangle of gold glinting in the darkness. The canvas was there, but even from 20 feet above, Hargrave could see that the composition had changed. The chair painted in the center of the canvas was empty. The figure of Elias Thorne, the man who had stared with such imperious arrogance only hours before, was gone. A cold sweat broke across Hargrave's forehead. The logic of the situation was impossible, yet the evidence was staining his carpet. The subject of the painting had not just moved. He had exited. Hargrave turned back to the corridor, raising his revolver. The trail of paint did not stop at the landing. It continued past him, leading further down the hall, toward the nursery wing where his 2 young daughters slept. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The entity wasn't coming for him. It was seeking something more vibrant, more malleable. "No," Hargrave whispered. He began to run, his bare feet slipping on the polished wood, chasing the trail of wet black footprints that seemed to darken the very air they passed through. As he ran, the walls of the house seemed to warp, the wallpaper patterns swirling into faces that mimicked the chaotic background of the cursed painting. The nursery wing of the Hargrave estate was designed to be a sanctuary of light and softness, decorated with pastel wallpapers and filled with imported porcelain dolls. But as Sir Julian Hargrave kicked open the double doors, the sanctuary had been desecrated. The air inside was not cold. It was chemically sharp, burning the lungs with the concentrated stench of linseed oil and heavy metallic dryers. The gas lights here were extinguished, but the room was not dark. It was illuminated by a flat, sourceless gray luminescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Hargrave realized with a jolt of nausea that the room was losing its 3-dimensional properties. The depth of the room seemed to be compressing, the furniture looking less like physical objects and more like skillful renderings on a flat surface. Standing between the 2 small brass beds where his daughters, Emily and Clara, slept, was the figure. It was Elias Thorne. But outside the confines of the frame, the entity was monstrous in its perfection. He stood 7 feet tall, his proportions elongated and elegant, his skin possessing the sheen of wet varnish. He was not looking at Hargrave. He was looking down at 7-year-old Emily, his black-gloved hand hovering inches above her sleeping face, trailing long, viscous threads of shadow like a puppeteer's strings. "Get away from them!" Hargrave shouted, the command cracking in the unnatural atmosphere. The figure did not flinch. It merely tilted its head, the movement smooth and hydraulic. "They are incomplete," Thorne's voice resonated, appearing to come from the walls rather than his mouth. "They lack ... permanence. I am fixing them. Fixing them." Hargrave raised the Webley revolver. He was a marksman, a man who had hunted big game in the colonies. At this range, he could not miss. He aimed for the center of the entity's chest and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening, a flat crack that shattered the silence. The bullet struck Thorne square in the sternum, but there was no spray of blood, no stagger of impact. Instead, the projectile hit the figure with a wet thwack, sinking into the chest cavity as if falling into a vat of fit tar. A ripple spread outward from the impact point, distorting the weave of Thorne's coat, before the surface settled back into perfect smoothness. The bullet had been absorbed. Thorne turned slowly to face Hargrave. The hole in his chest closed up with a sickening, slurping sound. Violence is such a crude tool, Sir Julian. It destroys matter. Art preserves it. Hargrave looked past the entity to his daughter. Emily had not woken up at the sound of the gunshot. She lay perfectly still on her back. Too still. Her chest was not rising. Her skin, usually flush with the pink warmth of childhood, had turned a pale, chaotic yellow, the color of old parchment. Hargrave rushed forward, ignoring the entity, and grabbed his daughter's hand. It was cold, but worse, it was hard. The skin did not yield to his touch. It felt like dry, cracked canvas. He looked closely at her face and screamed. Emily's eyelashes were no longer hair. They were fine, painted brush strokes. Her mouth was a static dab of rose madder. She was flattening, her physical form being rewritten, converted from biology into iconography. She was no longer a child. She was becoming a still life. She is beautiful now, Thorne remarked, stepping back to admire the transformation. She will never age. She will never weep. She is a masterpiece. Hargrave raised the gun again, pointing it at Thorne's face, his hand shaking violently. Don't, Thorne warned, his eyes narrowing into black crescents. If you disrupt the medium now, you ruin the composition. Do you want her to remain unfinished? A smear of paint on a ruined canvas. Hargrave froze. The logic was insane, nightmare logic, but in this room where reality was melting into oil, it held a terrifying weight. If his daughter was now paint, would shooting the painter destroy her, or merely leave her trapped in this half-state forever? While Hargrave hesitated, paralyzed by the impossible choice, the floorboards beneath his feet began to soften, turning into a sticky, swamp-like pigment. The house was not just haunted. It was being digested. Sir Julian Hargrave stood amidst the ruins of his reality, his boots sinking inches deep into the floorboards, which had lost their solidity, possessing now the consistency of thick, partially cured gum. He looked at the bed where his daughter lay. Emily was gone. In her place was a rendering of a sleeping child, perfect in every detail, flattened against the mattress. The sheets were no longer fabric. They were stiff, white ridges of impasto paint. There was no breath, no pulse, only the terrible stillness of a moment, captured and frozen forever. She is archival now, Thorne said, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. She will survive the rot of time. You should thank me. Hargrave didn't answer. A primal animal panic had overridden his shock. He backed away, his movements sluggish in the thickening air. He had to get out. He had to reach the foyer. The original painting, the source, the door through which this infection had entered, was downstairs. If he could destroy the canvas, perhaps the spell would break. Perhaps the oil would turn back into flesh. He turned and lunged for the nursery doors. He grabbed the brass handles and pulled. They didn't move. They didn't rattle. Hargrave looked closer. The handles were not brass. They were yellow ochre and raw sienna, skillfully applied to create the illusion of brass. The gap between the doors was a painted black line. The door itself was merely a texture on the wall, a trompe l'oeil meant to deceive the eye. He was trapped in a room that had become a two-dimensional prison. There is no exit from the composition, Julian, Thorne whispered from behind him. Not until the artist wills it. Hargrave roared, a sound of pure fury, and threw his entire body weight against the door. It didn't splinter like wood. It tore. With a sound like ripping sailcloth, Hargrave burst through the surface of the reality, stumbling out into the hallway. He fell onto the carpet, gasping. Behind him, the nursery was visible through the jagged tear in the air, not as a room, but as a flat image suspended in the darkness, the edges of the rip curling like burnt paper. He scrambled to his feet. The hallway was in the advanced stages of transformation. The walls were dripping. The damask wallpaper was sliding down in long vertical sloughs of wet pigment, revealing the gray, coarse weave of canvas beneath the plaster. The portraits of his ancestors hanging on the walls were weeping, their faces melting into shapeless smears of color. Hargrave ran. He ran toward the grand staircase, his feet splashing in the black ooze that covered the floor. The house was tilting, the perspective warping. The vanishing point at the end of the corridor seemed to be rushing toward him, threatening to crush him into a single geometrical point. He reached the landing and looked down into the foyer. It was a cavern of shadows. The chandelier had fallen, crashing into the floor, but it hadn't shattered. It lay embedded in the floorboards like a dropped object in soft clay. And there, standing at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for him, was the easel. The frame was empty. The canvas was white. The figure of Elias Thorne was no longer in the painting, nor was he in the nursery. He was everywhere. The house itself was the new body. Fire, Hargrave rasped, his mind seizing on the one thing that destroys art. Burn it all. He still held the brass candlestick in his left hand, though the candle had fallen out during his flight. He patted his nightshirt pocket. The box of lucifer matches. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. As he struck the match, the flame flared bright and orange. But it didn't look like fire. It looked like a static, painted representation of a flame-stiff, unmoving, and completely cold. The lucifer match hit the floor with the sound of a ceramic tile shattering. Sir Julian Hargrave watched the shards of the painted flame scatter across the melting rug, useless and cold. There would be no fire. There would be no cleansing destruction. The physics of combustion had been rewritten by the artist, and in this new gallery, nothing was permitted to change state unless the creator willed it. Hargrave collapsed at the bottom of the stairs. His legs had lost their structural integrity. He looked down at his knees and saw that the fabric of his nightshirt had fused with his skin. There was no longer a distinction between the man and his garments. They were becoming a single, continuous surface of texture and pigment. He tried to pull the cloth away, but the sensation was one of tearing his own flesh. He dragged himself across the foyer floor, which now possessed the viscosity of molasses. He was moving toward the front door, driven by a lizard-brain instinct for flight, though his rational mind knew there was likely nothing beyond that threshold but raw canvas weave. "You are making a mess, Julian," the voice said. It was intimate, whispering directly into his ear, though the hallway was empty. Composure is the essence of portraiture. Stop struggling. You are ruining the lines. Hargrave rolled onto his back. Looming over him was the easel. It had moved. It hadn't been dragged. It had simply relocated instantly and without sound to block his path to the door. The canvas was no longer white. It was a mirror. Or rather, it was a painting of a mirror so hyper-realistic that it reflected the room perfectly. But in the reflection, the room was not melting. It was pristine, elegant, and still. And in the center of that painted reflection stood Sir Julian Hargrave, but not the terrified, disheveled wretch currently lying in the sludge. The Hargrave in the painting was standing tall, dressed in his finest evening wear, one hand resting on a globe, the other tucked into his waistcoat. He looked powerful. He looked eternal. He looked dead. Hargrave stared at his idealized self, and his idealized self stared back with eyes that were glazed and hollow. "See?" Thorne's voice purred. "I have improved you. I have stripped away the fear, the sweat, the mortality. I have made you significant." Hargrave felt a tugging sensation in his chest, not a pain, but a displacement. It felt as though a hook had been inserted behind his sternum and was being slowly reeled in. He looked down. A stream of translucent shimmering vapor was rising from his chest, flowing through the air and sinking into the canvas. It wasn't vapor. It was him. He watched in mute horror as his memories, his will, and his very consciousness were siphoned out of his physical shell. He felt his peripheral vision fading, not into darkness, but into a static, flat gray. The three-dimensional world was collapsing. He tried to shout, to curse, to beg, but his jaw refused to open. His mouth felt stiff, heavy. He reached up to touch his face. His fingers encountered no softness, no warmth. They touched a hard, dry surface. He traced the line of his lips and felt only ridges of dried oil paint. He was hardening. The transformation was accelerating. His breathing stopped, not because he was suffocating, but because he no longer needed oxygen. He was becoming an object. The last thing Sir Julian Hargrave saw with his human eyes was the figure of Elias Thorne stepping out from the shadows of the foyer. Thorne held a long, fine-point brush tipped with a brilliant, wet white lead pigment. He smiled, a genuine workmanlike smile of a job well done. "Just the highlight in the eye," Thorne whispered, leaning toward Hargrave's freezing face. And then perfection. As the brush descended toward his eye, Hargrave didn't blink. He couldn't. The sun rose over Belgravia on the morning of January 17th with a crisp, indifferent brightness. It touched the limestone facades of the townhouses, offering no hint of the violation that had occurred behind the heavy oak doors of the Hargrave residence. The silence was broken at 6:30 a.m. by the scream of Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper. She had found the master of the house. When the authorities arrived, led by Inspector Aberline, a man weary from years of cataloging London's grim realities, they found a scene that defied forensic explanation. The physical damage to the house, the melting walls and warping floors that Hargrave had perceived in his final moments, was nowhere to be found. The hallway was pristine. The wallpaper was intact. The chandelier hung securely from the ceiling. Sir Julian Hargrave lay on the floor of the foyer. His body was not dissolved or melted. He was intact, but he was undeniably, horrifically dead. His face was frozen in a rictus of absolute terror, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide and milky, staring up at the wall above the staircase. His skin had the gray, dusty texture of old parchment, as if every drop of moisture had been evaporated from his cells. But it was what hung on the wall that silenced the policeman. In the heavy gold frame where the portrait of an unknown gentleman had hung only the day before, there was a new image. It was a full-length portrait of Sir Julian Hargrave. It was a masterpiece of the medium. The painted Hargrave stood tall and commanding, dressed in impeccable evening wear, his hand resting on a globe. His expression was one of serene, imperious wisdom, the exact opposite of the shriveled, terrified corpse lying beneath it. The eyes of the portrait sparkled with a wet, intelligent life, seeming to watch the police work with a sense of detached amusement. The paint was dry. It looked as though it had been varnished a century ago. Upstairs, in the nursery, a similar tragedy was discovered. 7-year-old Emily was found in her bed, cold and lifeless, her body rigid. Above her bed, pinned to the wall with a simple nail, was a small, exquisite oil painting of a sleeping child, rendered with such tenderness that it made the hardened inspector weep. The original canvas Lot 42, the painting of Elias Thorne, was found leaning against the wall in the scullery, discarded like rubbish. It was blank. The canvas was pristine white, primed but untouched. There was no trace of the man in the 1890s suit, no dark eyes, no sneer. It was a tabula rasa, an open door through which something had entered and subsequently left. The coroner's inquest was brief and inconclusive. Cause of death for both victims was listed as failure of the heart due to unknown causes. The story was suppressed to protect the family's reputation, burying the scandal in the dense archives of Victorian bureaucracy. The estate was auctioned off. The portrait of Sir Julian Hargrave was sold to a private collector in Paris. The painting of Emily went to a relative in Cornwall. They were separated, drifting into the vast current of antique art, hanging in hallways and galleries, watched by thousands of passing eyes. As for Elias Thorne, he was never seen again, at least not as a painting. But students of art history, Those who spend their lives studying the backgrounds of Victorian photographs and the crowds and sketches of London streets sometimes notice a recurring figure, a tall, pale man with sharp features and eyes that seem to absorb the light. He is seen standing in the background of a coronation, sitting in the audience of an opera, or walking away from the scene of a tragedy. He is always watching. He is always composed. And he is always looking for his next canvas. So the next time you stand before a portrait in a museum, admiring the lifelike glint in the subject's eye, or the way the gaze seems to follow you across the room, ask yourself, is it a trick of the light? Is it the skill of the master? Or are you looking at a prison?